Hello again, this is Carl from Living Outside the Grid. I have a kind of an interesting episode today. I want to talk about hugelkultur. That's hugelkultur. So basically, it's a type of gardening where you basically put wood underneath your garden. So wood underneath the soil. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, because the wood acts like a sponge and holds a lot of water. So in the spring, when it rains a lot and the ground is soaked, that wood is soaking up that water, and it will literally hydrate the whole bed from underneath. And it works amazingly well. Plus, I believe that it also builds the soil from underneath. So normally soil is built from the top layer. So where the mulch meets the soil, in those 6 inches or so, that is where most of the soil creation happens by the microbes and other small organisms in the soil. You know, like earthworms, for instance. Earthworms will grab a piece of dead grass and literally pull it right down under the soil. So the soil is normally made at the top, but with hugelkultur, it's also made underneath. And I think there's something about this, having living soil above and below a plant. It really kicks a plant into high gear. And you can see some of the different hugel beds that I've made over the years in these pictures. And I remember making a 3-foot by 8-foot hugel bed in Brattleboro, Vermont, back in 2016. I made 4 of them. And one of the beds, I just packed the tomato plants right in there. And they all grew like rockets. I mean, the plants were 6 feet tall easily. I think I must have gotten about 200 pounds of tomatoes off of that one 3-foot by 8-foot bed. Now, granted, the conditions were just right, but the hugel, the wood underneath, seemed to really make a difference. So, how do you make a hugel bed? Well, there's lots of different ways to make them. The people who I first learned how to make hugels from over at permies.com, which is a great website and a forum with very knowledgeable people about homesteading and permaculture and all kinds of interesting things. So I learned how to do this from them and from Paul Wheaton. And these pictures are from richearth.com, I believe, or Rich Soil. Anyway, it basically shows you that the garden bed over time has soil built underneath it by the decomposition of the wood. So by putting wood underneath your garden bed, you have, I believe, a double whammy. One is that your garden bed is going to require much less water. So if you live in an arid climate, the more wood you put under it, the less you're going to have to water it, basically. Many hugel beds that are kind of more like mounds above the ground, they have so much wood in them, probably 75% of the mass of the mound is wood with just soil over top. And they never have to water those in Montana for the entire summer. Montana is an arid, dry place. It's the thought that you could have a garden that you never had to water, that's pretty amazing. But here in the Northeast, you don't need that much wood in order to have the benefits because it rains much more often. So I wanted to see how we could make these so that it's not a giant mound in the ground and doesn't take a huge amount of soil to make the bed. So what I decided to do was to define where the bed is going to be by making a box where the bed is going to be. And then digging out the topsoil, usually sod, but it's the top, 6 inches of soil. The stuff that has all the weeds in it, and grass and weed seeds, that's where all of that stuff is. So I dig that stuff out first, and I'd put that over onto a tarp. And then on a separate tarp, I would dig down the next 6 inches and put that on the separate tarp. That is what I call the subsoil. So the subsoil basically will, in the end, in this way of making garden beds, be on the top, mixed 50-50 with compost. So mixing subsoil with compost means that you're going to have a lot fewer weed seeds in the topsoil of your garden, which over time will save you a ton of money, or not money, but time. It'll save you a ton of time. So basically what you want to do is you want to dig down the next 6 inches of subsoil, and then you're about a foot underground at that point, just under where your box is going to be. Then you find old wood, the more rotten the better, and you just stuff that first bottom 6 inches or so with the wood. So big sticks, little sticks, you name it, just pack it right in there. And then you take the soil that came from the top, the stuff that with a lot of weed seeds in it, and you fill in the spaces in between the wood with that weed seeded soil. And then you take the sod, like grass, and you put that upside down on top of the wood. And that way it prevents a lot of the grass from growing back, which, believe me, if you've ever had grass growing in your garden, you will hate it. There's no way to weed it out. The more you weed it, the faster it grows, it seems. So you want to try and keep the grass out of your garden as much as possible. So what you want to do is you want to basically get all that stuff with the weeds on the bottom that's covering your wood. And that way when the wood rots, it also will rot that organic material that was at the top. So then you take your subsoil and you put down a layer that's a few inches in the box. And at that point, you're probably close to being up to the regular ground level. So you put some of that in the box, then you put a few inches of compost. You make like kind of a layered subsoil compost layer on the box. And then you use a rake or a hoe to kind of mix it all together. That's what I've done. And then I put mulch on top. And wherever I've wanted to plant, I just kind of pull the mulch aside. And then right in the area where I want to either plant the seeds or put the plant start in. So this is a pretty interesting way to garden, actually, and it's well worth doing. So being a former scientist, I wanted to have a more definitive answer as to whether or not hugelkultur actually worked and how well it worked. So I set up an experiment. Now, you can do experiments with gardening, and it's a great thing to do because, most gardeners that I know, they kind of have the tendency to try out different things, but they don't really test it. Instead, they just try out grass clipping mulch on a particular bed, but all the other beds are different. They have different plants, different kinds of mulch maybe, so they don't really have any control. Now, what is a control? A control is everything is exactly the same in a second garden bed, except for the one variable, the thing that you're changing, like say mulch, or whether or not there's wood underneath. Whatever you think the factor is that's going to affect the overall production of the garden. So you can easily set up an experiment with one variable. I think everybody kind of intuitively knows how to do that. And you just can have two garden beds, one with and one without. That's the simplest experimental design. However, what I've learned back in the days when I used to work for Big Pharma, I learned a more powerful way to design experiments, and that's using what's called multivariate analysis. So variate meaning variable. A variable is the thing you change. So basically, you can test whether or not, say for instance, mulch works and how well it works, and you can test if hugelkultur works, one with wood underneath and one without. And that's exactly what I did back in 2016. And you can see in the experimental design that what you have is 4 garden beds, and each garden bed is exactly the same. It has the same soil at the top. It has the same plants, the same variety of plants, the same number of plants, the same placement of plants. Everything is the same except for the variable. And one of the variables was mulch, whether or not mulch affected the growth of a garden. And the other is whether or not wood was underneath the garden. So you can see that you have 4 beds in this experimental design. One bed, bed A, is no mulch and no wood underneath. So it's a bare dirt garden, just like the ones we always learned how to make. And the next one, the one next to that, doesn't have wood underneath. So that's bed B. That doesn't have wood underneath, but it does have mulch on top. The mulch I used in this case wasn't pure wood chips. It was basically chipped up branches, small branches, about the size of your finger or less. And the reason why I did that was because they have a higher percentage of nitrogen in that kind of mulch. I believe it's called Rainier chips. But I also chipped up a lot of the leaves, so there was green and brown all mixed together, chipped up, double chipped in a chipper. And that was used as mulch. And that seemed to work pretty good. Bed B doesn't have wood underneath, but it does have mulch on top. Bed C has wood underneath, but it does not have mulch on top. So that's a bare dirt garden, but it has wood underneath. Bed D has both wood underneath and mulch on top. So what were the results? Well, as you can see, the results were pretty striking. It was a dry summer, so I would love to reproduce this experiment during a wet summer, because we might have different results. But during a dry summer, this worked amazing. I tried to water each bed the same, but it became pretty clear pretty quickly that I had to water the bare dirt gardens much more than the ones with mulch on top. If I watered the ones with mulch on top the same amount, they would have gotten a little waterlogged. So basically you can see that the bed that did the worst was the one without wood underneath it and the one without mulch on top, the traditional garden bed. You can see the production wasn't that great. The next best one, or a step up from that, was bed B. The production was much better just by adding mulch. So even if you don't want to put a shovel in the ground, when you go to no-till system, which is the only way to build soil, when you go to a no-till system, you're going to want to carefully choose your mulch, you know. You don't want mulch that might have pesticides or herbicides in it, like a lot of hays do. So be careful of that. But you can easily make your mulch from dried leaves, from twigs, even from wood chips. Although I would not recommend mixing wood chips in with your soil because it might rob the nitrogen out of your soil. But that being said, wood chips do work as long as they stay on the top. They just take longer to break down. So the best result was actually bed D, even though it might not look it in the picture. And that's because I didn't put tomato cages. The back row is 2 tomato plants, and I didn't put them in cages. So basically, you can't tell how big those are. But if you could, you would see that the one with mulch and hugel underneath did the best. Although right now in the picture, they're kind of flopped over to the side. So anyway, those are the results from the experiment. I think it was pretty powerful. You can also see the effect of the mulch by comparing the final product, if you will, the final bed in late what was that? August 11th, I think. You can compare that to the other bed without the hugel. So for instance, bed D and bed B are the same except for the wood underneath. They both have mulch on the top, right? So that's like having one trial. That's like saying, I am doing an experiment with one trial and I'm testing to see whether or not the wood underneath makes a difference. So that's one trial. But there's a second trial, bed A and bed C. Both of those are exactly the same except for wood underneath. So you can see the effect of the wood underneath from comparing those beds like that. And you have 2 trials for each variable, which adds to the strength of the data. It adds to your confidence that what you're seeing is actually from that particular effector, if you will, that particular variable that you're changing. So hugelkultur, I found, is an incredibly great way to garden. I'm not 100% sure that in very wet climates it would work well, but that would be something that maybe you could figure out. So I would recommend using the experimental designs I've shown you to test lots of different things in your garden. It doesn't have to be hugel or mulch. It can be different tomato varieties, for instance. Just make sure that you have a control. And if you want to do more than say 2 variables, here's an example of how you could do 3 variables or 4 variables. So you can see that you can design your experiment to test for multiple variables at the same time. And since it takes a whole year to do an experiment, you might want to try and figure out more than one thing each year. So anyway, hope this was helpful and good luck with your gardening. I think gardening is really one of the best things that I really enjoy doing. I mean, the thing is that in the past, when I first started gardening, I would create so much work for myself because I basically had bare dirt gardens that I had to weed all the time. Even in the final product, a lot of the vegetables would be pretty dirty because the soil actually gets splattered, the bare soil actually gets splattered up onto the undersides of the leaves and the fruits of the plants when you have bare dirt. And I think that can be a vector for fungi and bacteria and all kinds of other things that can, damage your crop. So that's another good reason to have mulch. Plus, one thing that you might not know is that when you have a bare dirt soil, when it rains, each raindrop is falling from a long distance. And so it's like a little bullet and it will compact your soil right where it hits. If you can watch zoomed in videos of water droplets hitting soil, it looks almost like a crater on the moon. And if you have enough raindrops hitting all the soil, what you're doing is you're compacting the top layer. And bare dirt gardens often get kind of a crust on the top, which prevent rainwater from soaking in. So bare dirt gardens actually prevent the full benefit of the rain that we get. You need about twice as much rain in order to keep your garden hydrated without mulch. Plus the fact that the mulch prevents it from evaporating off the surface so fast. So I think I'm a big fan of mulch. I don't have to till my garden anymore. I got rid of my rototiller a while ago and haven't really needed it. I don't have to weed that much. I never have to fertilize because the mulch that you put on is the fertilizer. It's just that the microbes have to process it. And they literally do a much better job of fertilizing the plants than we ever could. So I try to create an environment that makes them happy. And when they're happy, they give me lots of good vegetables and they might make my plants happy. All right, well, that's all I have to say about this. Good luck and yeah, keep gardening. All right, till next time, thanks, bye.